Okay, I'm going to talk to you about universe design best practices. So a lot of these are best practices. Some of them you might find straightforward, but we'll go through three categories, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But just to get us started off, I feel like a universe is one of the best advantages SAP BusinessObjects has over other BI tools. So if you have a really good, well thought out, well-designed universe, I feel that's critical to a successful deployment, because at the end of it, end user doesn't want to use the universe, and they'll abandon it. And really, it's very important to a successful deployment. And in SAP, we have two tools that we could use. There's a legacy tool called Universe Design Tool, and then the new one, Information Design Tool. So the best practices we're going to talk about, they're for the most part apply to both, but when they don't, I'll point it out. So I've categorized the best practices in three different categories. The first one we'll talk about is user friendliness. So this is all about how we can make the universe as user-friendly for the end user. At the end of the day, the universe is for the end user. So our goal is to make it as easy for them to understand as possible, taking into account they may not be technical at all. The second one we'll talk about is designer friendliness. So these are going to be best practices around if, for example, if I built a universe and I needed to hand it off to someone urgently, something happened to me or I left the project. This is going to show you ways you can document it with notes and just keep it clean and organized. So if you were to pass it on to someone else, they can pick it up and not have to kind of reverse engineer it to figure out what you developed and why. And the last category we'll talk about is database friendliness. So this will all be about best practices around performance. So how can we return the results the quickest way possible from the database? Right, so the first category is user friendliness. So again, we talk about that a universe is only as good as your users think it is. So if you're, let's say, a very technical person and you design the universe and you know the tables in and out, that necessarily doesn't translate to a well thought out universe from an end user perspective. So we just always have to keep the end user in mind and build it for business people to use, assuming they're not technical. And again, I'm just pointing out again, if we don't have a good universe, it's going to be critical to your business objects deployment, because if the users are getting frustrated and overwhelmed when they open the universe to try to build reports, and I've seen this happen a lot, they will abandon the system and they'll go back to using their old reporting tools and they just won't use the universe. Okay, so who is the best person to build a universe? So a lot of people think maybe a DBA, and a DBA in a lot of ways is going to be critical to building a universe, but sometimes they're not the best person just because they're typically very technical and sometimes they don't see things the way an end user can see it. So in my personal opinion, I think the best person to build a universe would be a BA with SQL experience. And then you're not going to build the universe on your own. You're going to get some people together like power users, where you're going to get feedback from them and work with them on the structure and so on. Okay, so I recommend getting a team of power users, around 3 to 5 people, who will assist you in making the universe more user-friendly. So as you're designing the universe, you can get their feedback on the structures. They can review the design, make sure the folders and objects and everything looks to be something that they would use, and it's easy and straightforward for them to use. And if you design it well for the end user, they're going to market it for you when it goes into production and tell other people to use it as well. So the first thing we'll do is just go through some standard naming conventions, best practices. So for a universe, best practice, I typically like to use the system and then the name of the universe. So for example, if you were using a JD Edwards system, a good name for a universe would be JDE and then sales. And you don't want to use any separate connection names for dev, QA, and prod, and then that will make it easier to promote across the different environments. Same with connection name. If it's, again, if we're looking at the JD Edwards as an example, we could say JDE and then sales.cns is a good connection name. For data foundation, I like to use the prefix DF. So DF and then the universe name would be a good example of a best practice for data foundation naming. Okay, so a business layer is going to be accessed by the users. So the name should definitely be something that they're going to understand. And same idea. So if the name was sales ledger for the universe and the system was JD Edwards, you could call it JDE sales ledger. And then in the universe design, we use folder classes to organize different dimensions and measures. And so again, the name of the folder should represent the objects in the folder. So if a folder had sales order information in it, it should be called sales order, purchase order, for purchase order information, and so on. And I recommend grouping objects in folders based on object type. So put your dimensions in one folder, measures in the other. But if you're dealing with a small universe, it would be okay to combine like dimensions and conditions in one. And I'll just put a note at the bottom saying, I don't like to use underscores in anything the user sees or merge words together, such as like phone number. So in the example of phone number, I would write the whole thing out, but space it. So phone space number. And then don't use any abbreviations like phone and then the NO. Okay, and then some best practices around object naming. It's important to develop and follow a consistent naming convention. And then since the universe is for internal users, they want to see everything in business terms. So nothing technical from a database should ever be presented to a user in a universe. The object name should be clear. So for example, customer is not clear if you're saying ship to customer or sold to customer. It should be, the object name should be descriptive and describe what the object is. And consistency, they should be consistent. So if use the same name when you mean the same thing. So for example, in a universe, don't refer to a customer in one class as a customer, another class as a client. Refer them as a customer in every class. Okay, and this is really important. So every object should definitely have a description. And make sure your descriptions are approved by your power user team. So what I do is I present the power user team that's helping me build the universe with the list of objects that we're using in an Excel file, and they'll actually write the descriptions and then I'll enter them into the universe. Very important. And also very important for measure objects, include the calculation in your description. And then another tip is you can format all your numeric and data objects in the universe. Users can do this at the reporting level, but if you do it at a universe, the users won't have to reformat it every time they build a new report. And then to arrange your objects in a folder, they should be arranged alphabetically or hierarchically, depending on the needs of the users. So you want it to be easy as follows for the users. And I recommend minimizing the number of objects in each class to about 30 max objects. All right, so here's some, for example, the image on the right is showing what you shouldn't do. So if you have, for example, tables from a database, the users don't care about tables. So just because you have a bunch of tables in a database doesn't mean all those tables have to be translated to folders in a universe. So you should avoid using the auto class generation in the designer and just do it manually. And then for data objects, I would never use the automatic time hierarchy objects. Just do that yourself and do it the correct way. And it doesn't matter anyways, because this automatic time hierarchy is not even available in IDT. Okay, so for data objects, you can organize them in two different ways. So on the right, and sorry, the image is a bit blurry, but the first way you could organize them is a folder under the dimensions, under a class. So in this example, I've put a calendar class under the BOFS dimensions, and I've listed some date objects there. And the other way you can do it is create a subfolder inside the conditions folder and then create your time or date objects in there. And then again, this is just saying we don't want to create, you don't have to bring everything in the database into the universe. Just because there's a column in a table doesn't mean it's required in a universe. So it's good to talk to the power users, figure out what they want to see in the universe, and just start off small, and you can always add more objects later when the need arises. And then just a little bit about attributes. So an attribute is an object attached to a parent object. So in the example here, the object is class code and an attribute is class description. And each value of a parent object can only have one associated value of any attribute. So if it's incorrect, if you do it incorrectly in the universe design, an attribute tries to return multiple values for one parent, you'll get a multi-value error message. And then this is best practices about classes. I don't like to use more than 3 levels of folders. I find after 3 levels, it gets really overwhelming for an end user and they kind of get lost navigating the different folders. So a couple ways you could change that is 1, you could use subfolders, or 2, you could do a separator object. So this is the image I have here. So if we take the measures folder as an example, I've created 2 separator objects, one called sales measure and one called rental measures, just to separate the measures between and kind of organize it a little better. These are not used these don't do anything in the actual report. They're just used as basically headers and for organization. And then just another best practice is if you have multiple universes and you're using the same object in different universes, just make sure the naming convention is consistent across all your universes for that object.
So a quick question that came in, Isabel. Will we ever be able to right-click and sort objects with a class folder in IDT?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't. I mean,
I'll have to look into that. Yeah,
it's not a feature that is available. I don't know that it's on the roadmap at all, but it's an interesting point.
Yeah, that was a good question. Yeah, that is a good question.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, and we're going to talk about context more in the next couple sections, but in terms of for the end user, just make sure your context and contexts are used to solve SQL, chasm traps and fan traps and paths to loops, but just make sure they have user-friendly names and descriptions. And you want to definitely sort the context issues out in the universe level because you don't want the pop-ups to show up for the end user in the universe. I find that a lot of them get overwhelmed if they get a pop-up for, to sort a context when they're trying to build a report. So we want to make sure we get all the joins and loops figured out at the universe level. And then I'll quickly talk about list of values. So a list of values can be very helpful or very painful for the users. So you want to make them as user-friendly as possible. And you want to build them from dimension tables, not fact tables. If it's a large list, you can use the database delegated option. So the user doesn't have to scroll through the whole list. They can do a search and find the value they're looking for in using that feature. For lists that never or rarely change, you can use a static LOV. And you don't want to set a LOV option for each dimension. You want to use them for when only required objects, when you're using things like report prompts. And then I like to name my LOVs the same name as the object. So if I'm creating an LOV, for example, like city, then I would name the LOV city as well. I just find for troubleshooting, it makes it a lot easier. For predefined conditions, always give a description for the user of each predefined condition. And then just remember, if your condition is resulting in a prompt, make sure you have an associated dimension object, the associated dimension objects like city or year, whatever has the LOV list ready. And this is just an example of organizing LOV lists. Okay, and then this just talks about navigation paths. So I recommend never using that default hierarchy navigation path option. It never really makes sense, or it's never made sense to me. So what I recommend is just create at least one custom hierarchy, and that way, if you don't do that, it will set a default hierarchy. So just create at least one custom hierarchy, and this will help if you're doing a drill down or something. This defines the path of that drill down. Okay, so the next topic we're going to talk about is designer friendliness. And these are best practices around, like if I were to design a universe and something happened to me tomorrow, or I had to leave the project, I needed to hand the universe over to another developer, would they be able to figure out what I did with little effort? So the goal here is to well document everything, keep the UDT and or the IDT foundation structure pane clean. So one tip I have is I like to put the fact tables in the middle and then the dimension tables on the left or right of the fact tables. And then don't have your tables overlapping each other. Try to keep the tables that are joined together close to each other. It just makes it easier to see the relationships. Okay, so if you're creating alias or derived tables, and we'll talk about these more in a little bit, but from a naming convention, you want to use, I like to use the prefixes. So for alias, I like to use A underscore and then the alias table name. And for derived tables, it would be DT underscore and then the derived table name. And you definitely want to put comments next to any derived or alias tables you create to explain why you created them. And another tip is you can use partition on high volumes to boost your query performance. So this is just taking a large amount, it's going to break it down into smaller amounts, and then it's going to typically give you better performance when it runs. Okay. Here we're going to talk about, okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about derived tables. I personally I would recommend only using derived tables when it's absolutely necessary and as a last resort. And the reason is it's not a physical table and it kind of acts like a query. So it is going to affect your performance because every time the query runs, it's going to affect the performance of the database and the return. So I would recommend using them as a last resort. Like one example where you could use them is, let's say you had a requirement where it's a temporary solution. So for example, they are building it out in the ETL, but you need the derived table built as a temporary fix until that more long-term solution is built. You could use a derived table there. Another time maybe a derived table is necessary is maybe you have a very, very complex calculation that you can't get resolved using an aggregate table, then you could try to use a derived table. But again, I would use them as a last resort. But if you do use them, I write the SQL in a really easy to understand way for the derived tables. So they're easy for the next person to understand, again, if I had to hand over the universe. And then I'm just going to say that there is a comment box in the universe. You guys are probably aware of this, but there's a comment box that only developers can see. So definitely use this. And this is a great place so you can explain, why you built this way, why you did it this way. And it just keeps really good information for whoever has to take over your universe later. Okay. And same idea here, there's a universe release note. So under the properties, there's a place where you can keep track of each release of the universe. And okay, so here, another tip for designer friendliness is the cardinality. So you always want to set your cardinalities on your joins. It makes it easier to see how tables relate to each other. It also makes the detection routines work more accurately. And another tip is avoid keeping hanging, not join tables in the structure. This is a good tip. Avoid having joins that are not part of any context, and avoid having one-to-one joins. And okay, so now we're going to get into the database friendliness. So this is where we're going to show some best practices around how we can improve the performance. And so this is beneficial for the end user, so they get their returns quicker, and also for the DBAs. Okay, so don't use aliases to avoid creating contexts. Alias and contexts have different purposes, and they're not competing, they're not the same thing, and they're not competing against each other. So sometimes it's better to use an alias, sometimes it's better to use a context. It will depend on the situation. Contexts are a little bit more complicated to set up, but sometimes they are needed. And then if they're properly built, contexts, they don't help your queries run faster, but they'll cause less confusion for the users. So that's going back to, they won't get that pop-up when they run the report asking them to choose between different contexts. You can resolve all that at the universe level. And then this is about aggregate awareness, but there's an aggregate function. So every measure object that you create must have an aggregate function in the select. And if it doesn't get aggregate, there's no point to make it a measure. Okay, and then index awareness. So in IDT, there is a key tab. I don't know if you can see it in my screenshot, but what this does is it allows you to add, use the primary keys of the tables. And then what this will allow you to do is the queries, because you're connecting on that index, the primary key index, it will search those index columns, and it can sometimes reduce the number of joins and tables in the SQL. Okay, and then these next tips are, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but I've put them here if it's worked for me on some of the universes I've designed. But the first one is you can set in the universe query parameters, you can set the ANSI 92 parameter to yes. So this will generate more efficient SQL for modern databases. It will also allow the use of full outer joins in the universe. The next one is, if your database supports it, you can use the filter in from parameter to yes. So if you do set this to yes, the ANSI 92 also has to be set to yes. And what this does, it will move filters from the where clause to the from clause, and it may eliminate some of the processing time at the database. And then another thing you can try is you may also get improved performance by setting the join by SQL parameter to yes. But again, this is going to be based, we would have to look at the universe on a case-by-case basis and see if this would work. And the database connection parameters. So in here, you can set the array fetch size to at least 250. You can test it higher. So you could go as high as 1,000 and see if that gives you better performance. But you'll have to test it out and see what works better for your universe and your data. Query stripping, I use this a lot. So you can enable query stripping in IDT and Webby. So if you do the checkbox under the query options there and you select the query stripping, this will remove any unused objects from the SQL as it's sent to the database. So that should increase your performance. And then there's a place SQL for objects where you can keep the I recommend keeping the transformations to a minimum. So for example, if you did need to do some case statements at the universe level, I mean, if you really need to do it at the universe level, you could, but for the most part, it's going to slow, if you have too many in there, it will slow down the performance. So I would recommend doing that at the ETL level as much as you can. And then the other thing, and we talked about this a little in a previous slide, but you want to avoid clusters in a table that are not joined together. So if objects, like if you have stuff in your universe that are not, used together in the universe, then they probably belong in separate universes. And if you have a lot of like unjoined tables and things like that in your universe, then you risk more Cartesian products. And then just to conclude, I just said, so our goal is from an from a user friendliness perspective is to make the universe as easy to use for the end user as possible. So here I'm just saying, if there's anything you can do to help the end users, get more out of the universe, it should be done. And same goes with the designer friendliness. And I'm like this too, but sometimes when I'm developing something, I kind of leave the notes and stuff to the end, or I never get to it. But it's just really good practice to try to, when you do make a change in the universe, your added alias table or anything you did, just describe why in the notes, just so if you did have to hand it over to another developer, they would have those notes ready and they could understand what you did in a shorter amount of time. And that is it.
Fantastic.
Sorry,
This topic,
I wanted to use like demo, but it's hard to do with this type of presentation. So
no.
All right.
This is
All
all
right.
about best practices,
All right.
and a lot of things would be difficult to show anyway, especially when we're talking about naming conventions and and things like that. So I think you did a fantastic job, and to be, for full disclosure, I pushed Isabel to present this topic because she put a document together and I looked at it and said, oh my gosh, the world needs to know about this, because we forget about best practices in design of universe. We're so obsessed and used to teaching the mechanics of how to do it that we often forget about, well, what is the purpose of the universe and who are the people who are going to use it? And I love the fact that you suggested, groups of 3 to 5, business analysts should be the ones getting together to kind of define, right, what that universe should look like and so forth. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some pretty horrendous universes during your career. I know I have. And you kind of scratch your head and go, how on earth did that get designed or created? So this was fantastic. So thank you so much, Isabel. And we don't have any additional questions, just asking about showing the PowerPoint. We are planning to put a white paper together on this, which we hope will be issued in the next month. So we will get this information out to all of you who participated here today. Over to you, Lucy.